Okay, welcome. This talk is going to be all about what I call the anatomy of the sustainable web ecosystem. We're going to read chapter 2 from the text, Sustainable Web Ecosystem Design. When I talk about the anatomy of the sustainable web ecosystem, what we're talking about are all the important nodes that effectively go into building a stable, reliable, sustainable web infrastructure, right? A web-based environment. So you'll see, we'll look at some illustrations of each of the nodes that make up this ecosystem, and a lot of them are obviously technologically based, but we're also talking about living, breathing users, right, that we have to be considerate of on a lot of different levels. So it becomes this real sort of living and breathing ecosystem. So like I said, we'll look at each of the important nodes that goes into creating what we call a sustainable website. We will spend essentially the rest of the semester looking at different parts of this ecosystem in more detail. But today's talk is sort of an overview of how the ecosystem functions. And you know, a lot of this stuff is changing all the time. And you know, there's always something new coming down the road with web and with IT in general. So what we try to do is focus on the consistent elements, right? So something you learn in this class, something you read in this book will be relevant a year from now, 5 years from now. Maybe not to the T, but you know, the basic fundamental technologies and practices. So the anatomy of the sustainable web ecosystem can sort of be used as a theoretical model to kind of get your head around how all this stuff interacts with each other, as sort of a metaphor. But it's also, it can be used as a simple checklist, right? So if you're going to build a new website, you know, you can look at the anatomy and you'll have a real decent checklist of everything you need to do to consider to build a strong web presence, right? So with that said, if you have any questions at the end, of course, let me know as always, and let's get started.
So let's talk about this idea of the sustainable web ecosystem. First, it is a design methodology. Second, it is a sort of a theoretical idea. And third, it's an important idea because of why we need to think about how we build websites and web environments, and that we keep in mind that they are really these ecosystems and that we need to build them in sustainable ways. And so by understanding how the web works, knowing what's worked and what hasn't worked in the past, knowing what is new currently, what is being used currently, what sort of has these sustainable qualities to them. You know, you sort of learn as you go, in understanding how this whole web system works, and then in turn you can build your websites and your web content in the best ways possible. Let's take a look at each of these three parts. Let's look a little bit closer at what we mean by a design or a development methodology. When you're talking about a design or development methodology, you're talking about a method, right? A way of doing something. So in sustainable web ecosystem design, the methodology is to understand each of the parts, the important nodes of what makes up this ecosystem. So if you're talking about code, there are all kinds of things you want to know about code. If you're talking about the server, there are all kinds of things you want to know about hosting your website, right? So a little bit later in the talk, we will look at each of these parts, but the design and development methodology we're talking about here, it acts as almost like a checklist that you could use to go down the list when you're building a new website and make sure that you're looking at all the important parts, that you're taking all these important parts into consideration so that when you get to your the end of your, at least maybe even just your planning phase, maybe all the way to the end of your final website, you'll have a good understanding, and you'll feel confident that you have considered all the important parts of building that website. So now let's talk a little bit about what we mean by the theoretical model that the sustainable web ecosystem is. So beyond the practical checklist sort of use value of these nodes that we're going to look at throughout this entire class, really, you can think about the web as an ecosystem because not only do we have to be considerate of code and servers and security and other technological parts, but we also have to think about this in terms of our users, in terms of policy, in terms of keeping the web open, allowing for accessibility and fair access, fair use. So there are a lot of considerations that go into a website technologically, but once you start talking about the web as a concept, which is something that you are, as a web designer, as a web developer, as a content provider, whatever your role might be, as soon as you start to build on the web, you become part of this larger system. And because it includes living people, the term ecosystem makes perfect sense. So this is what I mean by it's sort of this theoretical model. There are considerations for building for the web that go beyond the technical code. Even considering things like when you're writing your HTML or your CSS, there we have this idea of using or writing clean code, right? And so part of the idea of writing clean code is, among other things, a consideration for other people who may come across that code at some point, may have a reason to access the code. Maybe you'll put it up as part of an open source project and share it and allow people to use your code. Maybe you will in your job you'll write some code and you'll have coworkers who need to work with the code as well. So you see, there's always this human element involved, right? So we need to be competent with the technologies, but ideally we also need to be aware of this larger theoretical context, right? So this is what we mean by the theoretical model, and you'll see throughout the course we are always sort of touching on these theoretical ideas. In the textbook, there's a little bit more, and you'll have a chance to read through that during the semester. In the hands-on labs in class, we try to focus on code and processes, technical processes. So the meat of the course is to get you all to be building websites, even if just, if it's your first website or your second website, but you want to be building them soundly. So this theoretical model is sort of the larger container that the class is in. And it's just something to start thinking about now. It's something to be aware of if you stay in the web field, which essentially if you're doing anything in IT anymore, you will be hard-pressed to avoid contact with the web. So as you move into your professional roles, it's important to like I said, be competent with the technology, and also know why you're being competent with the technology. And when you answer those questions, why are you being competent with the technology? That's when you start to brush up against some of these theoretical ideas. A few of which we'll talk about in the course. But so that's what we mean by a theoretical model of sustainable web ecosystem design. So you're probably starting to see how the whole ecosystem, the whole structure, sort of works together to become a good guide for you while you're building for the web. So we have sort of the two parts, which the first part would be sort of these, the checklist of best practices, the checklist of considerations while you're building, while you're designing, while you're developing, even while you're planning. And we'll see in a little bit how the planning is actually one of these important nodes. But then you have this sort of larger context, this theoretical model to use as even more of a guide for things to be considering while you're building, while you're maintaining, so on and so forth. So as we start to look more in more detail at the anatomy of the sustainable web ecosystem, I think that this will all come together nicely. It'll start to make sense as sort of this overall guide to building great websites. So let's break down the term here real quick. When we talk about sustainable web ecosystem design, the term sustainable, I'm sure it's familiar to all of you, but we're using it in this sort of larger context of a method of harvesting or using a resource so that the resource is not depleted or permanently damaged. This is kind of an eco-friendly use or definition of sustainable. But we're also talking here about building for the web so that you're considering all of the technological considerations. For example, all the devices that we need to be developing and designing for. For example, all the different user groups is another example. You want to be building for websites that are already in place, that might be built on some older technology. So there's these sort of backward-looking considerations, but also we want to be building in ways that we're looking towards the future, so that we're building, so that we can be creating sites that are user-friendly, that are easy to maintain, that aren't going to be built in a dead end, so to speak, so that we always have a way out, an easy way of updating and upgrading, because if there's anything that we know about technology is that it's always upgrading and updating, right? So that's what we're talking about, sustainable in that sense of the word, is that as difficult as it is, and we can't please everybody and please all the devices all the time, but we try to be looking at the most sustainable ways of building our websites. Which brings us to the second term in sustainable web ecosystem design, which is obviously web. This is probably the most intuitive part of the phrase. But to be clear, we're talking about websites, we're talking about mobile apps, we're talking about really anything that you can develop for the screen, anything you can design for the screen, any role you might be playing in that design, development, even in the planning stages. So really, it kind of encompasses a pretty good chunk of the digital media field. But when we're talking about web, when we're talking about digital media, so much of this digital media becomes part of the web. That there's quite a bit of overlap there, but for all intent and purpose in our class here, we're talking about, of course, the websites that we're building for class, but these are principles that you can bring out with you into the professional world, and they apply really to anything that you can build for the web. So now we come to the third part, which is ecosystem. And you may or may not be familiar with the idea of an ecosystem, but it is, to sort of sum it up, we're talking about these web systems, really. They're all sorts of different parts to building a website. So it becomes a system. And I like to call what we're working with here an ecosystem, because I think that what the web has become really is an ecosystem, because it's not just a system of files and code and images and so forth, but it becomes an ecosystem when you add this human element to it, because humans are obviously living components, right, to this system. And so I think that it becomes far more complex when you kind of go from this system of files and images and things to an ecosystem where we have to be considering humans, because we know how different humans can be, right? All the different conditions and situations and circumstances and needs and wants that a human can have really make this process far more complicated, I think, than it was even 5 or 10 years ago, before smartphones, really, when you could put up a few HTML files and stick a couple image tags in there and hope that your image path URLs stay intact, so you don't get that ugly missing image icon on your screen. And that was pretty much it for a long time. That sort of sufficed. By a long time, I mean 10 or 20 years. In general, it sort of sufficed as, when people thought about the internet or content on the internet or, a website on the internet. But it's obviously not the case anymore. And so all of these sites and apps and content and functions and services, they all need to be so dynamic and so customizable that it just has become a really complex condition. So with this element of the human being a part of this, now. It certainly has become an ecosystem, and the book talks a little bit about even some neuroimaging research, and some considerations about instead of just human computer interaction, we're talking about brain computer interaction, and how the human can really in innovative ways interact with the information that fills up the web. So it's a complex condition. It's a fascinating condition. I think it gets more and more interesting all the time to work with the web. It's also more and more challenging all the time because it continues to get more complex. But this is what we mean by the ecosystem. And, we sort of touched on some of these human element variables earlier in this talk. So that's the ecosystem part of our term. Now we come to the design part of our term. And what we mean here is more or less the idea of design as far as systems design, right? So we're not necessarily talking about graphic design here, although, of course, within this web ecosystem, all these considerations that we're working on, graphic design obviously plays a part, right? So it's like one of the nodes that we'll look at when you're talking about images or typography, a composition of a screen, a composition of your web page or your app page. So there are obviously graphic design considerations, and graphic design plays a big role in branding and identity and user experience and all sorts of things. So in fact, the web designer is that's obviously a professional role. And the web designer has to consider a lot of graphic design considerations, right? But here with sustainable web ecosystem design, we're talking not just about graphic design. We're talking in a larger context about systems design, right? So we're talking about sustainable web ecosystem, what it is, why it's important, and then our job is obviously to design part of that, to build part of that, to engineer a sustainable web ecosystem. So when you're building, when you're planning, when you're sketching, when you're designing, when you're developing, when you're writing code, these are all parts of the design, parts of the engineering. In fact, you could swap out the word engineering here for design. It just doesn't roll off the tongue so well. So you can think about this as when I write down what I do, I say front end web or web user interface engineering. So there's more to it than what you might think of as graphic design, right? So there's a lot to it. There's a lot to the engineering of these interfaces. You're creating ways in which humans are going to be interacting with information, right? So it's our job to, like I said, to plan, design, develop, to engineer these systems really, and then also to maintain them over the long term, and optimize them and do all the fun stuff we're going to learn how to do in this class. So that's how we use the term design in this context. So what we really have here with the anatomy of a sustainable web ecosystem design is a way that helps us to understand our goal, which really is something like a unified theory of front-end web and human interface engineering. So we're always looking for new ways, better ways, best practices to create this way of allowing for humans to successfully and maybe even with an entertainment element in a fun way, certainly in a healthy way, in a fair way, right? All these different ways of interacting, really one way with all these different variables involved to interact with whatever information on the web that they want to interact with. So what we're going to see and what we're going to work on in this class is right in this area of front-end web and human interface engineering. So we talk about the front end of the web. We're talking about not going too far into the core of the computer, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but all the way out to some design and development considerations for the user and our target audience. So we see how the media, or in our case the web, here shown by sort of an old-fashioned TV, fits directly in between the brain of the user, the interaction of the user, and really the world around them, or the world of information, at least around them. And so what we're going to be building is actually pretty important, because it plays this role as literally a medium, as an intermediary between the user and what they know about the world around them. So if we look at this anatomy, or this visual illustration, this set of nodes that makes up the web ecosystem here, we can see how it fits in this greater context. So we have the individual here, we have the media in the middle, and like I said, the sort of greater world around the individual on the other side of this sort of mediated barrier here. And it's within this situation that we see what we have, which all of this here is what actually makes up the sustainable web ecosystem, the anatomy of the web ecosystem. So if I can zoom in here, well, what you'll be able to see here, and I have this high resolution image posted in class, but you can see all these sort of primary nodes here: project management, architecture, maintenance. These are all these key nodes that make up the anatomy of the sustainable web ecosystem. So these are all the considerations. These are all of the elements that go into creating a website, and they're all necessary considerations when building a web environment. So the more you know about each of these, the more productive you'll be, the more competent you'll be in this field of web design and development. So a lot of these are also highly relevant to people who just use social media, for example, or people who may just provide content in a for maybe a company's website through a content management system, so on and so forth. So if we zoom in on our chart here, and we look at some of the individual nodes here of the anatomy, a lot of them will start to make pretty good sense. So for example, concept here is a main node of the anatomy, and you can see that within concept we have this idea of a common vision. There's processes involved like brainstorming and idea mapping. There is the importance of brand and a common message. as well as having this balanced media ecosystem. So this idea of concept comes into play pretty early on. So even before planning, you might start working on a concept. So this is something that we're going to talk about in class. Of course, we have programming, code, right? There's always a certain amount of programming involved in anything having to do with the web as far as building sites goes, because obviously the web is based in code, right? It's based in HTML. So there are some concepts involved with programming, such as stability. You want your code to be stable. You want your code to be lightweight and obviously secure. There are other ideas too: open access to code, open source. So there are a lot of different elements that have to do with code and with programming that are important, that need to be considered when you're working on a website. So this is something we'll also talk about in class. Of course, there's always text on a website, text in a web app, and writing is always an important part. So we have several different kinds of writing that could go into a web application. There's creative types of writing, technical writing, documentary writing. So what you want to be able to do is to create the right kind of voice to write in the correct way for whatever it is, whatever type of website or web application that you're building. So we'll talk a little bit about writing in this class. We have research. We have the node that I call research here, and you can see that this sort of starts moving out towards the theoretical, towards some of these ideas of the human user being an important consideration in any web application or any website that you're building. There are a lot of different ways of doing this research depending on the goals that you have. So if you you can have different types of goals. So you might be looking to improve your navigation functionality, or the findability of some information on your website, or just looking to improve usability overall. You might be interested in how your website is in turn affecting some of your users. So this idea of human and web research is really broad, and we certainly won't get to all of this in this class. But it's important to note that there are these practices in place, and that there are good reasons to be using some of these strategies. So if you had any of these goals, any goals that required a certain kind of usability, or maybe a focus group type research project, that these are available to you, and they're very much in use in building an ideal web presence. Of course, we have the famous image, right? Everybody knows of all kinds of ways to use images, share images, capture, edit, whatever you like to do with images. Images play an important role in any website. They add to a dynamic interface. There's all kinds of methods in capturing still imagery. Of course, video is just exponentially on the rise these days. There's video everywhere with everything. You have a number of different types of data visualization, a long list of data visualization techniques that you might use to visually communicate some information. So we have all kinds of variables that go into simply using an image of some sort in a website. So we'll talk a lot about images, and we'll get some hands-on as far as preparing images that you create or that you find that you want to use on the web, and what goes into preparing them for use on the web. We should have scalable vector graphics included here. So on and on. There's a lot of information to cover as far as images go. So we'll be working on that in this class as well. Project management is obviously an important part of creating a web project, a website. You can see here from just a quick glance at this chart here that there are a lot of different things to be considered as part of your project management. Everything from pre-production all the way to progressive enhancement. So we'll talk about this. We'll focus on some project management in two ways really in this class. We'll first do a group project that will the focus will be, as you know by now, will be on sort of all the pre-production, the planning, and all the way through some mock-up and wireframe stages. But you'll also be involved in a certain amount of project management, of course, in your final project, in your own website that you'll be building. So we'll look at not all of these areas, but a lot of them will come into play in the work that you do in this class. And also, these are, you can sort of mix and match as far as what you might need for a project here. So, you might not need each of these areas as part of a design document for every project that you do, but, you might sort of pick and choose, what you need based on your project, on your goals for the project, what your stakeholders need out of the project, so on and so forth. So we'll take a look at our project management node. Architecture is obviously an important part of any website or any web application. Usually we refer to this as the information architecture. This is sort of how we organize and make findable all of the information on a website. It doesn't seem like such a big deal if you have a small website, maybe like what we'll be building in class. If you have 4 or 5 files, 4 or 5 documents, 4 or 5 HTML pages or so, everything on the site is generally going to be what we call findable, right? Pretty easy for users to find. But when you start talking about much larger websites, some of them up to several hundred, several thousand, tens of thousands of files, or data-driven websites where you start looking at tables and tables worth of data that make up the content of the site, it starts to get pretty complex pretty quickly. So you need to have an intuitive architecture. We'll talk about taxonomy and vocabulary, intuitive tagging, even search engine optimization, both search, optimized for search within your site, optimized for search to find your site through popular search engines such as Google and Yahoo and Bing. So architecture is an important node of the sustainable web ecosystem. So we have maintenance as well. Maintenance being an important part of any website, anywhere from post-launch. So you do a lot of planning and production and development and designing your site and getting everything working how you want it to work, and then you have the big launch day and you launch your site, and then the fun begins of maintaining your site, right? So there are a lot of things to be considered, not just security patches that might come up for a content management system, for example. But you have your user's workflow. There are certain considerations for training your clients how to use the site, or your customers on how to use whatever it is that you built for them, whether it be within your company or external to your company. There's relationships, professional relations with content providers and user groups. There is a certain amount of maintenance involved in generating analytics, which is increasingly not just popular, but people sort of expect to be able to know who's using their site, when they're using it, how they're using it, so on and so forth. So generally all this falls in the hands of the design or the development person or team that built the site. Not always, but often it does. And so maintenance is an important consideration in the entire ecosystem that we're talking about. Okay, so also functionality. Functionality is an important part of your project. There are all kinds of elements involved with functionality, starting simply with what your client or your customers want the site to be able to do. So in order to carry out these goals, there are a certain amount of things you need to be aware of, from accessibility to being innovative. You want your sites to be universal, searchable. Of course, you want to create a project that's scalable, right? So if the company continues to grow, or their needs continue to increase, or simply the amount of content that they want to place on a website, you want the site to be scalable, so it's as easy as possible to maintain and to allow it to grow, right? You might have e-commerce considerations to make as well, so that's a big part of functionality in certain situations with certain types of websites. We talk a lot about responsive websites as well, so the idea that you can create one website and have it display nicely and be fully functional across multiple devices, mobile devices, phones and tablets, through different types of desktop, laptop computers, all the way up to maybe even a big screen TV. So if you can create one website that is usable and does what you want it to do and looks good doing it across all these devices, then you save yourself a lot of work having to build a mobile specific site or a certain native app for a certain mobile platform, so on and so forth. So functionality, in other words, what you want the site to do, how you want it to behave, is a big consideration in the sustainable web ecosystem. All right, so of course your website has to live somewhere. Generally they live on servers, which are basically just computers, hard drives. They don't all have monitors and keyboards like the one you're probably on right now. But servers are generally big hard drives that are connected to the network, and your files reside on the server, and then we browse through the web browser to find the site. In this class we'll be using the school-issued servers, so we'll get that all set up, and we'll be learning about file transfer and how to get files up there. We'll also be talking about how you want your servers to be stable and secure, for what are probably obvious reasons, but we'll talk a little bit about that, because where your website lives is obviously an important consideration in the entire ecosystem. And of course, security is a big consideration when you're building anything having to do with the web and having multiple users and having it available online. A lot of this overlaps with server, but you're also talking about security in your code. So best practices and security for your server host, best practices in security concerning the code that you use or that you write. Of course, with file transfer, there's security. Anytime you send or receive anything online, you want to be concerned, at least be aware of security. So this is something that we'll talk about in class as an important part of the sustainable web ecosystem. So concerning this class, if I zoom back out here and give you the mile-high view of our ecosystem anatomy, you can see how there are a lot of moving parts to any stable, successful ecosystem that you want to build, any web project that you have on the horizon or maybe are maintaining currently. There are a lot of things to consider, and so it's tough to be an expert in all of these areas. So you may be interested in one or two, maybe three or four of them, and those are the areas you can focus on, but it's good to understand all the different parts that go in, especially as you go into a potentially professional environment where you'll be working with designers and developers and writers and managers and so on and so forth. It's good to have an idea of really everything that goes into building what we sort of casually refer to as a website these days. So I think a lot of people don't realize how much there is to actually consider. So we will try to touch on each of these areas with a certain amount of detail and overview, but then we will also do quite a bit of hands-on work in each of these areas to get you to where you will feel comfortable being able to take on any of these tasks and build with a certain amount of competence, and hopefully be able to put a lot of that work and experience that you gain into your final project, which will turn in at the end of the semester, which is a lot of fun. So you can be thinking about all this now, and hopefully your brain is not hurting at the end of this talk. So from here on out, we'll focus on one of these nodes at a time. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time getting everybody familiar, so kind of get your head around what all goes into a roadmap that can grow quickly complex like this. But from here on out, it should be a lot of fun figuring out, understanding, getting our hands dirty in each of these areas, and hopefully build a fun project and make it worth our time. So let me know if you have any questions on any of these topics or the topic in general, as always, and we'll catch up in class soon.